The sun had just begun its descent beyond the ridge when I heard the crunch of tires on the gravel drive. The quiet hum of the lake, the gentle creak of the pines, the whisper of wind through the eaves, those sounds had been my peace for months. But now they were broken by the grinding intrusion of polished black SUV, winding their way up toward my cabin. I set down my coffee mug on the porch railing and watched them approach, 3 vehicles gleaming like oil against the rustic wood around me. 4 people stepped out, 3 men, 1 woman, all with identical clipboards and matching badges that read Lake Whisper Homeowners Association. Their posture said everything, authority assumed, not earned. The lead man didn't bother with introductions. "Sir, we've received several complaints regarding a non-compliant structure on community land," he said, his tone as dry as paperwork. "This property appears to have been built without the association's authorization. We'll need to conduct an inspection." I stared at him for a long moment. "You mean this cabin?" I asked, gesturing to the weathered logs behind me. "The one that's been standing here since before your community even existed." He flipped through his clipboard. "Our records don't show any approved building permits or architectural reviews. That means it's an unregistered construction, and therefore in violation of HOA bylaws." I couldn't help but laugh. The absurdity of it. The arrogance of claiming control over something they clearly didn't understand echoed across the still water. "You're telling me a cabin built in 1882 is illegal because it doesn't fit into your HOA database?" The woman with him stepped forward. She looked younger, but her tone was colder. "Regardless of when it was built, any property now within the community boundary must comply with current standards. That includes setback requirements, material codes, and aesthetic uniformity." I leaned against the porch railing, half amused, half angry. "Uniformity," I repeated slowly. "You want to make this uniform." My hand brushed the rough wood of the cabin wall hand, cut logs blackened by a century of winters. "These timbers were felled before your bylaws were even a thought. Every nail in this place was hammered by hand. It's part of the land itself." The man didn't flinch. "That may be true," he said, "but the rules are the rules." I could see what was happening. They were used to people folding, to frightened homeowners nodding along, to fear of fines and threats of legal letters. They didn't expect someone who actually knew where the lines were drawn, literally and historically. I pushed open the cabin door. "Come inside," I said. "Let's take a look at your so-called illegal structure." The air inside smelled of cedar and smoke. The fire from the night before still lingered faintly, and light filtered through the old glass windows, landing in soft golden stripes across the floorboards. I could feel their judgment hanging thick in the air, eyes darting to the uneven walls, the antique furniture, the stone hearth. It was as though they were inspecting a relic, not a home. I walked over to the chest by the window, an old oak box with rusted iron hinges. Inside lay the heart of the matter, what I had found months before in the county archives and kept safe ever since. I pulled out the rolled parchment, its edges browned with age, its wax seal still intact. I spread it across the table. "This," I said, my voice steady, "is the original deed to this property, issued under the Homestead Act of 1882, signed by the county's founding commissioner and recorded in ink older than your entire association." The lead man stepped closer, brow furrowing. "That can't possibly be valid. Read it," I said. He hesitated, but curiosity got the better of him. The parchment crackled as he unrolled it. The language was old, flowing, and exact, defining the boundaries by trees, creeks, and the ridge to the west. The signatures were faint but legible. The woman beside him leaned in, and her expression changed from confidence to confusion. This land was deeded in 1882 to the original settler. I continued. "Every transfer since then has honored that deed. Your HOA was founded in 1974, nearly a century later. which means this property has never fallen under your jurisdiction." The man looked at me, his jaw tightening. "That's highly unusual." "Not unusual," I said softly, "just inconvenient for you." He opened his mouth to argue, but the woman interrupted. "If what you're saying is true, then this parcel is exempt," I finished for her. Completely, the association boundary was drawn around it. You can see for yourself on the original plat map, this land has always stood apart. The silence that followed was heavy and awkward. I could almost hear the sound of their confidence deflating. They had come ready for confrontation, armed with clipboards and bylaws. But now they were standing in a piece of history. Something too old and too true to be boxed into their modern rules. I walked over to the fireplace and picked up a photograph that hung above it, sepia-toned, showing the first family who'd built the cabin. The father stood on the porch with an axe in his hand, his wife holding a lantern beside him. The lake shimmered behind them, the same lake that now reflected my own home. This place has seen floods, storms, and generations of hands keeping it alive, I said quietly. You think a committee meeting can erase that? The woman looked down at her clipboard. The others exchanged glances. I could see the fight draining out of them. They mumbled something about reviewing documents and verifying records, but the meaning was gone. They knew they'd overstepped. I walked them back outside, the boards of the porch groaning beneath our feet. The sky had turned a deeper orange now, the lake glowing like molten copper. The man paused by his SUV. "We'll follow up," he said stiffly. "You do that," I replied, "and when you do, make sure you start by reading the part that says permanent right of ownership. That's the one that matters." They drove away in silence, their tires spitting dust into the air. I stood there until the last sound of the engines faded down the hill. Then I turned back to the cabin, the same one they'd called illegal, and smiled. Inside, I placed the deed carefully back in its chest. The parchment was fragile, but the truth it carried wasn't. It was stronger than every rule and regulation they could invent. I stepped out onto the porch again, feeling the wind brush against my face. The lake was calm, the trees swayed gently, and the air smelled of pine and freedom. For a long moment I simply stood there, listening to the silence they'd disturbed now settling back into place. The world around me felt older, wiser, patient in its endurance. This cabin had belonged to time itself long before the HOA ever put pen to paper. And as the last light of day caught on the windows, turning them to gold, I whispered to no one but the woods and the water, "You built it right. They can't touch it." The breeze carried the words across the lake, a quiet promise between past and present. Out here, history still had a voice, and I had just made sure it was heard. 2 weeks passed before I saw the HOA again, though I'd known they'd be back. Bureaucracies never admit defeat easily. They just find thicker paper and more expensive pens. That morning, the lake was still, the fog sitting low like a soft white blanket over the water. I'd been splitting wood behind the cabin when I heard the slow, deliberate crunch of tires on gravel again. This time, only one vehicle, a white SUV, spotless, city bred, rolled up to the gate. Out stepped a man in a dark navy suit that didn't belong anywhere near dirt roads, followed by the same woman who'd come before. She looked uneasy now, like she knew she was walking back into something she couldn't quite control. "Mr. Collins," the lawyer began as he approached, his tone calm but calculated. He carried a black briefcase and the kind of confidence that came from hourly billing. "The association has reviewed your documents, and while they are historically interesting, there are still issues of jurisdiction. Your parcel technically falls within the modern community boundary. As such, the association maintains limited oversight authority." I rested the axe against the chopping block, wiped my hands on my jeans, and let out a slow breath. "Limited oversight," I repeated, tasting the words. "That's a fancy way of saying you still think you own a piece of my land." The lawyer smiled thinly. The kind of smile that's meant to seem polite, but really says you'll lose anyway. We're simply ensuring all residents adhere to community standards. Surely, you understand the importance of harmony within shared property lines. Harmony, I said, almost to myself. That's what you call threatening letters and false claims. The woman winced slightly but stayed quiet. I could tell she hadn't wanted to come. Maybe she'd realized what this place represented. The kind of history that didn't fit neatly into their bylaws. Tell you what, I said finally, you've come all this way. Let me show you something you missed last time. They followed me around the back of the cabin, through the underbrush where ferns brushed at our legs and pine needles carpeted the earth. The forest air was cool and damp, smelling of moss and earth. A few yards from the cabin, I stopped at a stone marker half buried in the ground. I crouched and brushed away the moss until the carved initials appeared. J.C.M. 1882. This is one of 4 boundary markers, I said. Set by James C. Merton, the original surveyor. The locations are listed right in the deed. The other 3 are along the creek, by the ridge, and near the lake's bend. The coordinates match the county's GIS records exactly. This marker right here, I tapped the stone with my boot, sits 50 feet outside your HOA southern border. The lawyer bent down, squinting at the engraving. Even if that's accurate, he said, straightening his tie, community integration laws can still allow annexation of adjacent properties. That includes oversight and shared easements. I looked at him and smiled the way my grandfather used to when he knew someone was bluffing at cards. Except no annexation was ever filed. I checked the registrar's records myself. There's no petition, no vote, no signature, and no recorded notice of expansion, which means, legally speaking, your association can't claim this property or any part of it. The lawyer's face shifted just slightly, the first crack in his composure. He opened his mouth to speak, but the woman stepped forward, her voice lower this time. Mr. Collins, please understand, this isn't personal. We're trying to maintain consistent property values and community safety standards. Safety? I asked. You think safety is a uniform paint color and a trimmed hedge? This place has stood through blizzards, fires, and floods. I don't need an HOA to tell me how to take care of what's already lasting longer than they've been alive. I started walking toward the lake, and they followed almost reluctantly. The fog was lifting now, revealing the dock stretching out into the quiet water. Its boards were uneven but sturdy, dark with age and rain. I stopped at the edge, the old timber creaking softly under my boots. See that dock? I said. Built by the first settlers, they used it to unload supplies from rafts before there were roads. I rebuilt it myself last spring using the same timber joints they did. You can still see the original nails, square and handmade. That's history, not a violation. The lawyer crossed his arms. We're not disputing the historical significance, Mr. Collins, but as part of a larger residential district, we have responsibilities to all property owners. I turned back toward him. Then maybe your responsibilities should start with learning where your property ends. You came here assuming authority you never had. You threatened me with fines for a home your rules don't touch. You call this community, but it's control, and the difference between the two, I said, stepping closer, is consent. He flinched just a fraction. The woman looked down, her clipboard trembling slightly in her hands. I walked over to the old oak tree near the shoreline and rested my palm against its bark. It had been here as long as the cabin, maybe longer. You see this tree, the deed mentions it, beginning at the great oak by the water's bend. It's not a survey coordinate or a street number. It's a promise written into history. You can't rewrite it. With bylaws and board votes, the lawyer cleared his throat. You seem very confident in your interpretation, but I assure you, our legal department will review every aspect of your claim. I hope they do, I said, my voice calm but sharp as the lake wind, because if they look closely, they'll find something interesting. Your HOA has been collecting dues and enforcing regulations on land parcels that were never officially annexed. Some of those owners might be very curious about that. The air went still. I could see the thought hit him like a stone sinking in water. The woman's eyes widened slightly. She understood what that meant. If what I said was true, and it was, it could unravel years of their so-called authority. The lawyer pressed his lips together, the confidence gone. "We'll review the matter further," he said stiffly. "You do that?" I replied, turning back toward the lake. "But next time, bring someone who knows how to read history instead of just rule books." They didn't have much left to say. The lawyer gave a curt nod. The woman murmured something that sounded like an apology, and they made their way back to the SUV. I watched as the tires crunched over the gravel and disappeared down the road, leaving nothing but the echo of retreat. When they were gone, I stood there for a long time. The lake had turned glassy again, perfectly still, reflecting the cabin and the forest like a mirror of time. The air smelled of pine and smoke from the fire I'd started earlier. I walked back inside and took the old deed from the mantel where it hung framed in glass. The parchment was yellow and fragile, but the ink, deep black strokes from another century, still held its strength. I traced the date with my finger, June 14, 1882, the day this land was claimed by people who had nothing but grit and faith in their hands. I felt the same defiance they must have felt when they built this place with their own sweat and will. Bureaucrats could come and go, but truth like this, truth carved into earth and paper, endures. That night, the wind rose through the trees, carrying the soft murmur of the lake against the shore. The fire in the hearth burned low, flickering against the glass that held the deed. The cabin groaned softly in the wind, alive and timeless. I sat by the window, watching the stars come out over the water, and smiled. Let them send letters, let them draft rules. I had something older, something unbreakable. This land wasn't theirs to take, or to govern, or to tame. It was mine by right, by history, and by the simple truth that roots deeper than law always hold fast.